Today at the National Press Club, Australia's 29th Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull. At the start of the election campaign, Mr Turnbull will discuss sovereignty and security in his speech titled Australia and the New World Disorder. Malcolm Turnbull with today's National Press Club address.
Hello and welcome to the National Press Club and today's Westpac address. My name is Andrew Tillett and I'm the Defence and Foreign Affairs Correspondent for the Australian Financial Review and Vice President here at the club. Our guest today is the 29th Prime Minister of Australia, Malcolm Turnbull. Our records tell us that this will be Mr Turnbull's 18th address at the club. His first speech here was in 1992 with the Australian Republican movement, but it's a different kind of Republican Mr Turnbull has in mind today. Getting ahead of ourselves there. Obviously, talking about the current occupant of the White House, Donald Trump. Mr Turnbull was Prime Minister when Trump became President the first time 8 years ago, but I think as the world is seeing, Trump Mark II is a very different beast. That has inspired Mr Turnbull to raise some very uncomfortable home truths about what Trump means for Australia's place in the world and the need for us to seek out our own security and assert our sovereignty. And nowhere is this more obvious than the AUKUS nuclear-powered submarine pact and the dependence it has left us on American benevolence. To further that discussion, Malcolm yesterday hosted here at the club a forum of more than 100 of Australia's top strategic analysts, drawing upon backgrounds in the military, bureaucracy, intelligence and academia. And he'll share some of those insights. And all this is happening against the backdrop of a federal election on May 3. So I'm sure there'll be maybe a couple of questions about that, including who Mr Turnbull might be voting for. You can follow today's conversation at Press Club Aust or hashtag MPC. We have lots to talk about, so please everyone welcome Malcolm Turnbull for his address.
Well, thank you, Andrew. Look, I can forgive you for that momentary confusion. I am, after all, wearing a blue suit and a red tie. Now, we had a very good forum here on sovereignty and security yesterday, and I know some of the participants were here. It was a long day, but it was a really detailed discussion about these big issues, some of which I will touch on today, and we will have there'll be podcasts out later in the week, and everyone will be able to listen to it and watch it and so forth. But to today. Now, in the foreword to the 2017 Foreign Policy White Paper, I wrote, "More than ever, Australia must be sovereign, not reliant. We must take responsibility for our own security and prosperity while recognising we are stronger when sharing the burden of leadership with trusted partners and friends." And in that white paper, we set out 5 objectives of fundamental importance to Australian security and prosperity. And since there hasn't been a new white paper, I think they're still current. I think you'd agree they would be. The first was to promote an open, inclusive and prosperous Indo-Pacific in which the rights of all states are protected. The second was to deliver more opportunities for our businesses globally and stand against protectionism. The third was ensure Australians remain safe, secure and free in the face of threats such as terrorism. The fourth was to promote and protect the international rules that support stability and prosperity and enable cooperation to tackle global challenges. And finally, step up support for a more resilient Pacific and Timor-Leste. Now, in early 2017, we were confident that those goals were shared by the United States. The real agenda of Trump's first administration had not yet taken shape, and his protectionism still seemed more rhetorical than real. But today, we have a US president who believes tariff is the most beautiful world. So the United States does not share the second objective at all. And the first and third objectives, which look to the preservation of an international rules-based order, are also plainly no longer shared by the United States. Mr Trump has said he will get Greenland one way or the other and has repeatedly refused to rule out the possibility of doing so with military force. Greenland is a territory of Denmark, a NATO ally. The Vice President, Mr Vance, has even been to Greenland and said our message to Denmark is simple: you've not done a good job by the people of Greenland. Now, as if that were not enough, Mr Trump has described the border between Canada and the United States as fictional, declared that Canada has no economic future other than as the 51st state, he's imposed crippling tariffs on Canada, all in breach of the free trade agreement he signed in 2017. The former Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, after speaking to Trump a few weeks ago, said what he wants is to see a total collapse of the Canadian economy because that'll make it easier to annex us. Trump has, however, generously said that the Canadians can keep their beautiful anthem, "O Canada," but it will, of course, be the anthem of an American state, not an independent country. Now, there's an eerie resonance between the language Trump uses about Canada and the language Putin uses about Ukraine. Borders are fictional, doesn't deserve to be a separate country, and so forth. And then I need not remind you of the shameful way Trump has treated Ukraine. In his endeavour to broker a peace deal, rather than using American might to compel the aggressor to come to the table, he's humiliated and kneecapped the weaker, wronged party, cutting off military aid and intelligence sharing until Zelensky agreed to a ceasefire. And if that punching down wasn't bad enough, he's taken the opportunity to demand a huge share of Ukraine's mineral resources as compensation for the aid America has already given. So, simply stated, the United States under President Trump does not share the values we've shared with every single one of his predecessors, Republican and Democrat, for over 80 years. And he does not pretend to share them. This is a feature, not a bug, of the Trump administration. Now, Australian sovereignty, sovereign autonomy, has never been so important, and yet, in recent years, it has been diminished. Now, the change of policy and attitude by Mr. Trump does not mean we will not have shared interests with the United States. A key one will be to encourage the US to remain engaged in our region, not as the dominant hegemon as it was 30 years ago, those days have passed quite a while ago, but as a balancing force to China. And it's why these dramatic changes in the United States, many of which have been evident in less stark form for years, should not lead us to abandon the ANZUS alliance. We have so much in common, so many interests in common with the United States, even if we don't have as many values as we used to. But instead of our defence forces being a useful auxiliary component to support United States operations, almost incapable of acting independently, they need to become a genuine sovereign force capable of defending Australia, of deterring adversaries without relying on American support. Now, that was a key topic at yesterday's forum here in this room. It means we must urgently develop a much larger sovereign defence industry. In other words, we need to make much more of our own capabilities, and we've got great examples. So many countries with much smaller GDPs than ours are much more self-reliant in terms of their military capabilities. You know, I regret to say that while the Pentagon regards the US military industrial base as an essential part of their national security, our own defence establishment does not feel the same way about the Australian defence sector. So this will require political leadership. And of course, this is not helped by the rivers of gold flowing to the UK and the US for AUKUS Pillar 1, all of which, as everyone in this town knows, is progressively impoverishing the rest of the defence budget, as you see other programs cancelled and delayed. Now, Mr. Dutton recently said we cannot assume the cavalry will always ride over the hill to save us. He's absolutely right. But unfortunately, during his time as Defence Minister, we became more dependent on that cavalry than ever. In other words, instead of our alliance with the US being a means for Australia to support United States primacy in the region and United States goals in the region, it should be a means by which we could expect, but not be assured of, American assistance to defend our own country. In other words, there is one way in which our leaders need to be a little bit like Donald Trump. They have to put Australia first. We'll need to make it very clear where we differ from the US, whether it's on trade, climate or international law. In recent years, our influence in the region has been diminished by the perception that we are just a rubber stamp for Washington. I've heard this directly from leaders and foreign ministers in the region. AUKUS did not help in that regard, as it was seen in the region as us running back to our former and current imperial masters. Today we need more than ever to have a distinctly Australian foreign policy, one in which we will, on many important issues, differ markedly from the United States. Of course, and I say this with respect to many fine diplomats here in this room, Our foreign policy has never been a facsimile of the Americans. But even when we have independently come to the same view, it's been easy for others to assume that we were acting under orders. And Gareth Evans spoke very eloquently about that yesterday. And as you know, he doesn't act under orders from anyone. We'll need to work with other countries to counteract the consequences of the trade war Mr. Trump is inflicting on the world. We can build, for example, on the model of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is alive and flourishing without the United States. And we'll need to weigh up, as historian James Curran reminded us yesterday, of all the benefits we've brought to the American alliance, and in the same transactional way Trump treats us, calculate which of those we will withdraw or qualify. The United States is a friend, but my plea to Australian politicians is get off your knees and stand up for Australia. Be as transactional with America as it is with us, and remember, in the imperial capital they always regard deference as their due. Trying to get into a race of who can do the most sucking up, particularly with Mr. Trump, as I know from direct experience, is not the way to advance your interests or your nation's interests. Now, our best asset for the United States in strategic terms is our geography. It was in MacArthur's day, and it is today. But as one example, how do we feel about providing at our multi-billion-dollar cost a base and maintenance facilities for American nuclear submarines in Perth in circumstances where we see massive tariffs imposed on our exports to the United States despite a free trade agreement, pressure to compromise our pharmaceutical benefits scheme with the goal of making Australians pay more for medicine, interference with our sovereign right to regulate social media platforms, a global trade war unleashed which could severely damage our economy and in all likelihood end up with no submarines, a subject to which I will now turn. Now, it's bad enough that the AUKUS project was born in deceit, but none of us will forget Emmanuel Macron's droll, "I don't think I know," but I'm not going to go into that history today. But there are two observations I want to make about the past. First, the total failure of process in deciding on the AUKUS plan. Conceived in secret in a small group around the Prime Minister, there was no proper analysis of alternatives. This has been the subject of express, detailed criticism by the influential Congressional Research Service of the US Congress, which notes that projects without a rigorous analysis of this kind invariably end in tears. And we know that, I think all of us know that. Second, of course, the Labor Party, then in opposition, signed up to AUKUS on 24 hours' notice in a shadow cabinet phone hookup with no papers. Their only concern was not to get wedged as being weak on national security in the lead up to the 2022 election. Once elected, the Albanese government remained on board. Again, I would say, they might argue this, for the same political reasons. Now, neither the government nor the opposition are confronting the reality of the AUKUS submarine plan, neither are managing the risks responsibly, and as a consequence, the Australian people are being gravely misled as to the risks. So let me set out the facts, and just two acronyms. SSN stands for Ship Submersible Nuclear and means a nuclear submarine that is not a ballistic submarine with deterrent nuclear ballistic missiles, which of course is called an SSBN. We're not getting any of those. We're not planning to get any of those, at least as far as I'm aware. I haven't checked my news feed. The object of AUKUS Pillar 1 is for Australia to acquire a fleet of nuclear-powered submarines. That was the rationale for dumping attack class, although the obvious option of talking to France about naval nuclear propulsion was never taken up. That, again, has never been explained. The long-term AUKUS plan was and remains to partner with the British to build a new submarine known as SSN AUKUS, or SNORKUS for its friends, and this was the as-yet undesigned successor to Britain's existing SSN, the Astute. Now, powerful arguments have been made, were made here yesterday, that even if the SNORKUS were built, it would be the wrong boat, too big, too few and too expensive to own. Recently, the UK's own Infrastructure and Projects Authority has red-flagged the program to develop the new reactor cores for this submarine as, and I quote, "successful delivery of the project appears to be unachievable." So the British project is in plenty of trouble. However, regardless of its merits, the first SNORKUS would not be available in the UK until 2039 at the earliest, and assuming parallel production in Adelaide, not available here until the early 2040s. As we all know, given that all projects of this scale and complexity run over budget and are late, the availability is likely to be delayed. As the already elderly Collins-class submarines, our current boats, diesel-electric boats, would retire well before the Snorkus could start to arrive, there was the need for a submarine to fill the capability gap. And so, it was decided that Australia would acquire 2 second-hand Virginia-class SSNs in each of 2032 and 2035, with 18 to 27 years each of remaining service, with a third to be new in 2038, with an expected 33-year service life, and if the Snorkus was delayed further, there was an option to acquire 2 additional ones. At the same time, we're building a submarine base, 4 nuclear submarines in Perth at our expense, and by 2027, the United States and Royal Navy nuclear submarines will be rotating out of that base. We're also providing basic in-water maintenance, will be providing basic in-water maintenance of the kind currently provided to the US Navy at Guam. We're also providing an additional $3 billion to the United States government. You saw Richard Marles make the first $500 million US payment recently, shortly before the steel tariffs were imposed, and that is to support their submarine industrial base, and the same amount to the UK to support theirs. So just looking at the US, look at the deal from their point of view, and this is when people say, will Donald Trump like the AUKUS deal? I mean, why wouldn't you? They're getting a brand new submarine base and maintenance centre for their nukes in Perth. They're getting $3 billion US, and furthermore, bright young Australian sailors are training to serve on their nuclear submarines and are already being peppered through the ranks of the US Navy. And according to Joe Courtney, the congressman who represents the District of Groton in the Congress, they're doing really well and topping the class. So we've got some of the best and the brightest of our sailors serving in American submarines. But will we ever get them? In truth, in my view, there's very little prospect of doing so. They are the most valuable and survivable assets in the US Navy, and the US Navy does not have enough of them. Right now, the US Navy has 49 SSNs, including 23 very old Los Angeles-class boats and 2 older Seawolf-class boats, all due to retire in the normal course of events by 2030. The older boats are retiring faster than they can be replaced. Only 2.5 years ago, the incoming Chief of the Navy, Admiral Franchetti, said the Navy aimed to lift production to 1.4 Virginias a year by 23, 1.5 by 24, reaching 2 by 28, which is the level the US Navy says it needs to meet their needs. The average rate for the last 3 years has not budged. It remains at 1.2. As of the 11th of March, the US Navy says the production rate is 1.1 boats a year. And from the next year, there'll be increased pressure because the shipyards have got to build the new SSBNs, the Columbia class, each of which is about 2.5 times the cost and size and man-hours of a Virginia. Now, if the goal is to complete 2 Virginias, and the new models are longer because they have an additional payload module, it effectively means these shipyards, which are struggling, will have to quintuple their rate of submarine production by 28 compared to what they built in 2011. And there's no evidence to date that they'll do so. So the upshot is that by 2032, the US Navy will have fewer SSNs than it does today and is likely to have a fleet of only 32 boats. On the most optimistic view, they'll still be 25 boats short of the 66, which is their goal. Their maintenance is blown out. They have massive problems in their submarine industrial base. And I have to say, you may compare this with our own Defence Department, they are very, very upfront about it. You can read all about it in the submissions to the Congress. It is all set out there. Now, there's been more than $9 billion US of additional funding has gone into this since 2018, but the build rates have not improved. There are comprehensive research reports that set all this out. I mentioned the Congressional Research Service. The Congressional Budget Office also does a great job. The United States Congress is far better informed about AUKUS than our Parliament is. That's a fact. Now, that's no doubt why the Congress made the transfer of any Virginia-class submarines to Australia conditional on the President certifying 270 days before such transfer that, among other things, the transfer would not degrade the undersea capabilities of the US Navy, and that their own submarine industrial base had the capacity to supply both the needs of the American Navy and ours. And as Dennis Richardson, former Secretary of Defence, head of ASIO, ambassador, as I said yesterday, he's had every job in Canberra except the one I had. But he, as Dennis said yesterday at the forum, the President has to certify that the Australian government has the capacity to receive and manage the nuclear submarines. In other words, the risk of non-delivery is not solely limited to American circumstances, but let's focus on that. So in 2031, the next president after Mr Trump will be faced with a navy short of SSNs and a threat from the Chinese Navy likely to be greater than it is today, and at the same time, as the several admirals here I'm sure would agree, vulnerable surface ships have become even more vulnerable. So the relative value of submarines has increased. Whether they'll become more vulnerable too is another issue. But in any event, do we really expect the President would give the certification that the US Navy does not need three of its most valuable and survivable assets? The Congressional Budget Office estimates that depending on whether Australia acquired 3 or 5 Virginias, the loss to the US Navy would range from 65 operational years to 102 operational years between 2032 and 2060. Now, even if you do not believe the risk of getting no subs is very high, there is plainly a risk. It was contemplated by the parties and it is set out in the legislation. It's part of the deal. So if in 2031 or 2032 the President would decide that their Navy gets preference over ours, and I would remind you that in the great race of life always backs self-interest because you know it's trying, then we could not say we were let down or that the US had reneged. The risk of non-delivery was assumed by Australia's government with their eyes wide open. But that risk is unacknowledged by either the government or the opposition. Neither of them have any plan to take account of it. In other words, there's no recognition of this very high risk that in the next decade and much of the one after we'll have no submarines at all. So speculating on whether Trump likes AUKUS or not is pointless. The decision will be taken by a successor, and that successor, no matter how many koalas on the mantelpiece, will act in the interests of the US Navy. No matter how much sucking up goes on, none of us are voting in their elections. So I just say this to you as a former politician. Be pragmatic about it. So what do we do if we have no subs? And here let me take on the point attributed to Dennis Richardson yesterday in the press, which Dennis feels was not quite accurate, but anyway, I'll deal with what was attributed to Dennis without trying to verbal him. But it was attributed to him that he was saying it was unhelpful of me to persistently ask this difficult question, and was reported that he was suggesting that merely by asking the question it made the Virginias less likely to appear. That is like saying the little boy who pointed out the Emperor had no clothes was responsible for the Emperor catching a cold. The availability of the Virginias will depend on the subjective decision of the President of the day and will be influenced by many factors, almost all of which are out of our control. Production rates, size of the US fleet, nature of the Chinese threat, perceived need for submarines and so on. So those who say we should not ask the question are saying we should do nothing to plan how to respond to a clear, known and foreseeable risk whose chances of arising are, for the reasons I've laid out, increasing. Now, the Americans, however, do have a plan B, and from their point it is completely consistent with AUKUS. That plan is where Australia has no submarines at all, instead purchases other long-range strike capabilities, drones, missiles, perhaps even a B-21 stealth bomber. As for submarines, the US Navy would base a fleet of SSNs in Perth and hopefully provide us with the submarine protection we could no longer do for ourselves. You can read all about that, set out in some detail in the Congressional Research Service's lengthy report on AUKUS Pillar 1. But even if we were to go down that route, I don't think many people in this room would think that's a good idea, we'll have to start making plans and acquisitions now. On the other hand, if we don't want to end up with no submarines, what are we going to do? Yesterday, Rear Admiral Peter Briggs made a very, very, I thought, compelling submission about these issues, and former submariner, of course, and he advocated that we should go back to France to get the rights to build a fleet of Suffren-class nuclear boats, which he argues are more suitable for Australia than either the larger Virginia or SNAUKUS, and the Suffren, of course, was the nuclear boat on which the attack class was based. Now, this would be very, very hard to achieve, but it is at least a plan. If that could not be done, then I guess we'd have to consider whether a class of diesel-electric submarines would be better than no subs at all. But the most important thing, the urgent thing we need, is an honest conversation about this issue. And I just have no confidence that the Australian Navy or the Department of Defence will engage in this unless they are directed to do so by government. Whichever government is returned, it should do so. Now, look, 3 years ago, I gave advice to the incoming government to be totally transparent, put all the cards on the table, set out what the realistic options are to address the capability gap, how much they'll cost and at what risk. And I'm sorry they chose not to do that. Truth and transparency build trust. And at the moment, we've got neither on this issue. 3 years on, the consequences of not doing that are all too evident. If the big parties won't face reality, then it may be that Australians will need the crossbench, assuming they have the balance of power, to demand that there be a thorough and urgent assessment of the state of the AUKUS submarine project, a rigorous analysis of the risks, and a clear assessment of the measures and alternative options that are available to address those risks. Hope is not a strategy. It's better described as danger's comforter, a solace for those who have already lost. We do need a plan B, and not one where the B stands for blindness, as in willful blindness. Thank you very much.
I will just point out that Donald Trump is talking about running for a third term. He's assuring us he's looking into it, so it may well be his decision.
That is true. It's hard to keep up with his ambition.
Talking about Plan B, I think one of the issues with Plan B is there's not many sort of credible options, given that Australia's record on submarines is burning everyone who has offered to sell us one, essentially. We saw, obviously, your predecessor, Tony Abbott, with the wink and the handshake deal with the Japanese, obviously torched the relationship with the French over the attack class. We talk about the need for a Plan B, but what is a realistic Plan B given the record?
You cannot deal with a risk unless you acknowledge it exists. I mean, this is the fundamental problem, that there is literally in denial. I won't say who it was. I was speaking to a very senior official in this area the other day, and I said, "What is your plan if the Virginias do not arrive?" And he said to me, looked me straight in the eye, and he said, "They will arrive." And I said, "That's actually not the answer to the question I asked." I said, "What will you do if they don't?" He said, "They will arrive." After he'd said that a few times, I said, "This is like me saying to you, I am having a party in, the park or the garden on Sunday and invite you, and if you say to me, you ask me, what are you going to do if it rains? And I say, it won't rain. I mean, we have a real risk here that is contemplated by the parties. It is real. It's set out. It's been flagged by the new Deputy Secretary of Defence, Bridge Colby, in his confirmation hearings. It's self-evident, but denial. Now, here's the problem. You're right, Andrew. The alternative submarine plans are difficult, but they're not even being looked at. The doing nothing, however, is even worse, because then you have nothing. At least if you say, all right, the odds are we are not going to get any subs for all the reasons I've described, let's acquire some other long-range capabilities that may not be as effective as submarines, but at least do something. It is as though the government and the opposition are frozen in some kind of bipartisan terror of admitting to the truth. That's the problem. That's where the system is failing us. Bipartisanship is all very well, but not when the two sides of politics are united in error.
And do you worry, when you were Prime Minister, you did 3 big shipbuilding decisions, the attack class, Hunter class frigates, and the OPV vessels. For the people who aren't defence wonks, the Hunter class frigates has been cut from 9 ships to 6 ships.
Same company that's going to build the snorkers too.
Yep.
Yeah.
And the OPVs, they've cut the order in half from 12 to 6. And that has follow-on consequences for things like mine hunters and stuff like that.
Yep.
How much do you worry about governments and defence bureaucrats essentially treating almost, it seems like a very cavalier decisions about telling, oh, we'll have that and then we'll cut that and things like that. And as a result, we end up with a Navy that is older, smaller, more fragile than it's been.
Well, I think, look, defence has got to be, all of us have to be judged by the outcomes. And the outcomes you've described are shocking ones. I mean, at least I can say, in my own, I'm not, saying I did a, dramatically better job than anyone else, but at least I can say that the decisions that were taken about shipbuilding, including submarines under my government, were the consequence of a process. I mean, Dennis Richardson said that yesterday. The decision to go with France was the result of a competitive evaluation process that actually started under Abbott, was conducted without any political interference at all, recommended we go with France. My cabinet accepted the recommendation and off we went. But then, as you know, Scott blew that up in what was a, like a very unilateral one-man decision, effectively. Yeah.
Cool. Our first question from the floor is David Crowe.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Thanks, Mr Turnbull, for your speech. There was a lot there, and I was really struck by your remark about Australian leaders needing to be a little bit like Donald Trump, and especially a little bit transactional like Donald Trump, because that raises this question which is around us at the moment about what we're seeing from Washington DC on tariffs, imminent decisions on tariffs, and this message overnight from the trade advisors around Donald Trump about problems with Australia on the pharmaceutical benefit scheme, on quarantine regulations that they don't like, and also on the news media bargaining code. So they're already sending some signals about what they don't like from us on trade, just as they're about to do more on tariffs. So your remark about being a bit more transactional raises this question of how do we calculate what we would withdraw from the relationship? And I'm interested in your thoughts on what's realistically possible in withdrawing something from the relationship if we have to get as transactional as the Trump administration is?
Well, that's why you need to have a very careful assessment of it. But I mean, I think you could start with the $3 billion or the $2.5 billion that's left that's being handed over to support the US submarine industrial base. I mean, look, do you think we win any respect from Trump by being such a pushover? I mean, really, so timid, so, deferential. I mean, the only, as you know, I'm not a particularly sort of timid person, I guess, but the best thing that happened to me, and frankly, to the government and the country in dealing with Trump Mark I, was that it began with that unholy row over the refugee deal, and that won his respect. And then we had a very good relationship after that. So, you've got to be prepared to be as tough as him. And I mean, look at Mark Carney. I mean, Mark Carney succeeded. The Liberal Party in Canada, which is the centre-left party there, as everyone knows, was gone for all money. They were, they might have ended up with a handful of seats in their House of Commons. The election changed leader. Mark is running purely. His platform is elbows up, which I gather is a ice hockey term, which means getting really tough with your opponents.
Shirt fronting, perhaps.
Yeah, shirt fronting. Yes, whatever. The Canadians can translate. I don't have no idea what it is in Quebecois, but probably much nastier, much tougher. But anyway, bottom line is, you see, he will get the respect from the United States because Trump will see this guy's standing up to me. He's tough and he's got the backing of his country.
Can I have a follow-up, Andrew? Sure. Because one thing Mark Carney has done is that he sent a message to the States about not buying the F-35.
Correct.
So he's put fighter planes on the agenda.
Sure.
Do you think Australia should be talking tough in the same way?
Well, we certainly, exactly. I mean, I'm not saying that is the particular right decision. I noticed Peter Dutton has said he wants to buy a new squadron of them.
Yeah. I
mean, that is definitely why you certainly shouldn't be saying that, I wouldn't have thought. That sends quite the wrong signal. But you've got to basically look, this is why we need to have a proper conversation about this. And this is what we were having yesterday. But you can't keep on pretending it's not happening. I mean, there is there is a big, moving to another marine metaphor, there is a big whale in the bay called Donald Trump, splashing around, wetting everybody and creating mayhem, and our political class are pretending it's not there.
Thanks.
Our next question is from Ben Papham.
Thank you, Mr. Turnbull, for your speech. You say you have to be tough to deal with Donald Trump. Peter Dutton, says he's the guy to do that. He can stand up to Trump and also forge a productive working relationship. Anthony Albanese, he's struggling to get a call with Trump. Maybe that won't hurt him in the long run, depending on what happens with the tariffs decision. But from your perspective, who would be the better leader to deal with Donald Trump?
Look, I honestly couldn't pick between them, really. Being frank with you, I think it's really hard to say. I think Dutton has a particular challenge. It's sort of a bit of a two-edged coin, two-edged sword for Dutton. On the one hand, he would say, I've got a great relationship with Gina Rinehart. She's a friend. She's one of the biggest donors to the Liberal Party and to Dutton's cause, and she's made a beeline for Trump, and he would say he's got access to Trump through all of those connections. I don't think that'd do you any good, but anyway, that's the sort of the pitch, and that's the kind of thing that, frankly, on the sort of right-wing media, that is the line that is being put. Dutton is closer to Trump politically, therefore he'd be able to deal better with it. That's one side of the coin. On the other side of the coin, the problem Peter has is that his political environment is that right-wing media ecosystem. Scarf to Dark, the shock jocks, Murdoch tabloids, your paper. That's part of the world in which he operates, and it's all tied up with Fox News, which is intimately connected to the Trump administration. So the difficulty of taking on Trump is you're then taking on the most popular person in the ecosystem in which you live. Okay, so I think the only way you'll find out is if he becomes Prime Minister and does it. Albanese doesn't have that. He doesn't have the advantage of great connections through plutocrats and billionaires, but he also doesn't have the problem that his political base, his media environment, if you like, is fanboys for Donald Trump.
Thank you.
What about the PM's current strategy seems to be just keep your head down, try not to cause trouble with Trump and things like that.
There's no point. It's not a question of causing trouble, right? And there is. I noticed. I gave a sort of a pretty mundane, I thought, interview with Bloomberg the other day on markets and geopolitics. We talked about Trump, and Trump was obviously watching it, took exception to it, and put out a post, having a go at me, which, as you can see, shattered me. But it didn't shatter me very much. But you saw the media. The Malcolm Turnbull has ruined the chance of the tariffs, and created the most terrible tension at Holt Street. It really did. Who are we going to blame for the steel and aluminium tariffs? Do we blame Albo? Do we blame Malcolm? Do we blame Kevin Rudd? And if we blame Kevin, then we can't blame the other two. If we blame Malcolm, we can't blame Albo. So it was challenging. But anyway, as it happened, nobody got an exemption, which was exactly what I predicted. But we have got to stop running around pretending that there is not an issue here and self-censoring ourselves. Does Donald Trump self-censor himself? Of course he doesn't. If you want to be respected by people like Trump, you have to stand up for yourself. Full stop. I'm not in the first bloom of youth, and Trump is not the first bullying billionaire I've dealt with over the years, so I can tell you this is the right. I'm confident in this judgment. Please.
Thanks. Yes, Kat Wong for our next question.
All right, thank you so much for your address, Mr. Turnbull. So Dutton's public sector cuts and his commitment to, addressing a woke school agenda appear to take inspiration from Trump. Should Australia be looking to the US for policy inspiration right now, and what kinds of risks does this pose?
Well, I definitely wouldn't. As to whether Peter Dutton is taking inspiration from Donald Trump, that's matter for you to write about, or Albanese to claim. I'm not going to buy into that, but certainly I wouldn't be taking inspiration from Donald Trump's policy agenda. leaving aside all the public service cuts and the Doge stuff, you know, and the DEI campaign and anti-DEI campaign and the, you know, down with work from home. I mean, none of that's very popular here, of course. But the big thing is protectionism. I mean, we are a open trading country. I cannot tell you the damage that, well, you know, the damage, I mean, Heather Smith spoke about it very eloquently yesterday, very experienced as both an economist and as a national security specialist. You know, we face enormous damage, potentially, from a global trade war, because it's not just the tariffs on our stuff that goes to America, it means there'll be retaliations around the world and the trading system will close up. And, you know, this is what made the Great Depression as bad as it was, America doing this in the Smoot-Hawley tariffs initially. And it wasn't just the Smoot-Hawley tariff, by the way, and again, one of the speakers yesterday made that point. It wasn't just those tariffs, it was the fact that everyone retaliated. You know, so it's a chain reaction.
Thank you.
How do you feel about the current election that we've got at the moment? Are you planning to...
I find it really one of the most exciting elections I've ever seen, don't you? I mean, I just can't drag myself away from the television. No, I've seen a few. I tell you what, I was just, you know, I mean, it is sort of, there are certain, it's kind of a cultural continuities, you know, the democracy sausage, Anthony Green, of course. For this election at least, and also, of course, wars about corflutes. Oh yes, you know, putting corflutes up. He stole my corflute. You know, where's my corflute? No, I didn't. Yes, it's great. So if you've run as I have in a marginal seat, you know, and obviously ended up not being marginal, at least for my candidacy, but you get into all this grassroots stuff, and I don't miss it. No.
Are you planning on campaigning at all for the Liberal Party?
No, I think it. Look, no, I'm not. I'm not campaigning for anyone. No.
Voting Liberal though?
Secret ballot.
Next question from Andrew Green.
Andrew Green from the ABC. I'll say one thing about this campaign. At least it's not 8 weeks.
Yes. Well, there you go. That was a low blow, but I accept it. There were very good reasons for that. You could say you should have come in with the sort of additional punch. You know, you could have said it's not 8 weeks and it's not in the middle of winter.
Mr. Turnbull, I want to ask you about something you touched on in your speech, which was Ukraine. We're seeing the world lining up in various camps on this question. The Australian Prime Minister is in favour of peacekeepers being sent to that country once a peace is established. The opposition here doesn't think that is a good idea. What is your opinion?
Look, I thought Albanese made the right decision there, and I'll explain why. He stayed in the conversation. The signal Dutton was sending will be seen as washing our hands of Ukraine. It was quite. I mean, I think. Look, it was a judgment call. I mean, everyone makes mistakes. I think he made a wrong call there. Look, obviously, the peacekeepers do not go there unless there is peace. And the Russians have said they'll never accept them. So this is all hypothetical. But you know what Albanese basically said, yes, we'll stay in the conversation. We're committed to supporting Ukraine. We'll send someone along to the meeting and, you know, subject to, you know, a million factors, you know, we're not in principle, we were in principle happy to be part of it. I think that was a better call. He hasn't committed to anything, and as I said, the peacekeepers only turn up if there is peace. So I think Peter, you know, and again, as you know, you've identified a few potentially errors that I made, but yes, we all make mistakes. So there it is. I don't think much will turn on it, but I think it sent a. I thought it sent the wrong signal, to be honest. I think solidarity with Ukraine is very important. And it's important if you want to distinguish yourself from Trump too. You know, if that's part of your political mission, communication mission.
Thank you. Next question from Kim Bergman.
Kim Bergman, thank you very much for the address. And I suspect your visa to the US is going to be cancelled, so let's continue with how to make Donald Trump happy. And the background is this still mysterious deal cooked up by the government that failed, something to do with giving the US access to Australian minerals or something. And I'm reminded of Trump's meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, where Trump repeatedly talked about wanting raw earths rather than, I assume, rare earths.
Yeah.
But then I thought about it. Maybe we should take him literally. Could Australia appease him by sending over 10,000 tonnes of Australian dirt?
Yeah, well, we send a lot more tonnes of Australian dirt to China in the form of iron ore. Yeah, well, look, I don't know. I mean, I think it's really, you talk about offending Trump. I mean, there's nothing I've said today that isn't just, describing what is actually happening. I mean, we can't allow ourselves to get into this issue where we're not prepared to tell the truth about global affairs, really, because it's just wrong. I mean, if we're a free country, proud country, we've got to be able to say what we feel, talk about it, and particularly, if you can address things in an intelligent, factual way, be able to do so.
Sure. My more serious point was, should governments be trading off mineral resources in an attempt to...
Well, they don't own them, right? So, for example, go and have a talk to the recently elected West Australian Premier about trading off mineral rights from Western Australia. They do not belong to the Commonwealth Government. So, if there are no barriers to American investment in this country. If they want to invest in, rare earths or any sort of mineral activities in Australia, the door is open. So it's not. I don't think. That's it. That's basically the answer.
Thank you.
Next question from James Riley.
Thanks, Mr. Turnbull. James Riley from innovationoz.com. I wanted to ask you about some Pillar 2 issues and deep tech broadly.
Yeah.
When you were Prime Minister, through the National Innovation Science Agenda, you unlocked a good deal of capital and really bolstered the venture capital industry here in Australia. I think it's fair to say that a fair bit of that unlocked capital is going to dual-use technologies now, particularly as we're talking about the sovereign stuff. So I wanted to...
And dual use,
defence and commercial applications.
Yeah.
So generally by private sector companies developing new tech. So I guess I want to ask you, the mechanisms they have in place now, this government has in place now, the things like the National Reconstruction Fund, Future Made in Australia initiatives, all right, as a mechanism for funding some of these things. What do you think of those? And in terms of the dual use tech, things like data centres and AI, access to space, quantum sensing, quantum computing, those things. What are the sort of non-negotiables that you think that Australia needs to have sovereign ownership and control?
Well, I think we have to have data sovereignty. I think that is, we've regarded the United States, AUKUS Pillar 2, which I think is very undeveloped. There is not a lot to show for AUKUS Pillar 2 at this stage. There's been very little money put into it. When you ask people in government what's going on with it, they'll say there's stuff going on, but it's all too secret, which makes me suggest there isn't nearly enough going on with it. So it's a great idea. There's nothing wrong with that. I think this issue of sovereignty, we've always regarded ourselves, as I said at the outset, of having absolutely shared, almost always we've had shared interests. They haven't always been shared, but definitely shared values with the Americans. Now, if it becomes apparent that has issues about security and sovereignty, then we may have to reconsider some of those assumptions. This is a very, very dynamic and turbulent time. So I wouldn't want to give a categorical answer there, but it is, we are in a rapidly changing environment. Yesterday at the conference, a lot of people made the point, and they were right, that a lot of these, that in a sense, I think Hugh White said, Donald Trump has done us a favour in the sense that he has made absolutely stark staring obvious what was already happening. In other words, America, withdrawing from global leadership, partly because it didn't have the resources to do so, and partly because it was becoming more inwardly focused. Biden was not a protectionist in Trump's league, but he kept Trump's tariffs on China and added a few more of his own. So this is why we shouldn't assume that this is just a blip and is going to be gone, when Trump finishes his second or possibly his third term. It'll all be over. Because I think that he's captured the zeitgeist. America first is the zeitgeist, and I think that may, that we just have to look after ourselves. We cannot assume that any other country has our best interests at heart. We really can't, and we have tended to do that, and we've got to stop doing it.
Thank you. Next question from Ben Westcott.
Ben Westcott from Bloomberg. Thank you so much for your speech, Mr. Turnbull. And if I could just take exception to one thing you said, I don't think any interview on Bloomberg can be described as mundane.
No, I was talking about me. The interviewer was fantastic. I was the mundanity was mine. No, it wasn't. Anyway, you know what I mean.
It's a really fascinating poll published today in the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age by Resolve found that 46% of Australians thought that the actions of the Trump administration meant that Australia should look to improve its relations with regional partners, including China. Now, I think, and we saw a little bit of this at your summit yesterday, there can be the impression that this is a zero-sum game, that if the US is becoming a less reliable partner, we need to turn to another country, and that country is China as the other superpower in the world. But I wanted to get your opinion on that. I mean, do you think that the instability in the US means that China becomes a more appealing partner for Australia, or should we assume that two countries can both be unreliable partners to us at the same time?
Well, look, I don't think... I mean, China is a partner, on the economic front and indeed in many other areas. And there are plenty of technological areas where we cooperate and could do more. I'm president of the International Hydropower Association, and Lucy and I have a renewable development company working on some pumped hydro projects. The expertise and experience in China on pumped hydro, where they're building an enormous amount of it, is very valuable. And I would really welcome the opportunity to learn more from their experience. But there are security issues, and so you've got to look at the relationship, I guess, with other countries in some ways a bit like the way you look at relations with other people. There is a boundary of trust. There are things you would say to your wife or your husband that you may not say to your best friend, and there are things you would say to your best friend that you wouldn't say to everybody you work with. And so I think that we have a much greater circle of trust with the United States, but as do all its allies. I mean, the US, one of the US's greatest assets vis-a-vis China in terms of geopolitical competition is the alliance system. China has very few allies, if you can call it that, whereas America has many. But there is no question, of course this is the point I made on Bloomberg that upset Mr. Trump so much, so I hope he's not watching the ABC, but otherwise you'll get another Truth Social post. But the point is that China will take advantage of this. Now, we are not trying to hedge between China and the United States. We are very committed to the relationship with the United States, and the upsetting, the disrupting of that relationship is coming solely from the Washington end at the moment. There are plenty of countries in our region, though, and elsewhere in the world, who do hedge between China and the United States. And the more, if the United States inflicts serious economic damage on a country, they will look more favourably on China. So I think that's, it is a competitive world out there. America is not the sole superpower it once was.
Thanks very much.
You hear that sort of particularly critique made around, I guess, Asian countries, ASEAN countries.
Yep.
So Indonesia, probably the good example of that. But I mean, what about what we would call the Western liberal democracies, Europe, Australia, Japan? How much do you think that the countries that we grouped in with those will splinter and fray away from the US?
Well, I mean, they're being pushed away. I mean, Donald Trump has said the European Union was established to defraud the United States, right? That's it. So he's, I mean, just take him at his word. I mean, he has described Zelensky as a dictator. He said Zelensky started the war. I mean,
I think it's
I think it's not a question. it's not a question of people, and this is something, I say this to the media present here, it's really important to get your heads around the reality that there is no one in Australia that I'm familiar with anyway that is wanting to pull away from the United States. The problem is that the relationship is being disrupted by the United States. We've got, I think the Australian had a piece describing me as, the disruptor, Malcolm Turnbull, the disruptor. I mean, I am an apprentice compared to what Donald Trump is doing. I mean, he is the one that is disrupting these relationships, and is doing it deliberately, and he says he is. So it's not as though this is happening accidentally.
What I was getting at though is the solidarity among the Western countries.
Yeah.
When does that sort of, when does...
Well, that's a very good question. So have you seen any expressions of solidarity from the Australian government for what Canada's going through?
Nothing springs to mind.
There you go. Yeah, and we share the same monarch. So.
Not the same currency though.
No, that's true.
They've got the best one in the world, the loonie.
The loonie, yeah. Anyway, so I think solidarity is going to have to. I mean, where is what solid? I mean, Dennis Richardson again. I'm quoting Dennis all the time, but he's a very wise, experienced man. I mean, Dennis made the point yesterday, and no one would accuse Dennis of being anything other than completely committed to the US alliance. But Dennis said, "What do we do if Trump sends, a military detachment, wouldn't have to be very big, you'd assume, to literally occupy and take over Greenland? There's only 57,000 people there, and just literally say, we have annexed this island, this is now ours, this is now US territory." NATO, he has not ruled that out, and he said, I will get it one way or the other. What if he does that? What do we say? How are we going to vote in the UN? There will be people in this country who will say, oh gosh, you'll have to abstain in the UN. Couldn't possibly condemn the United States. Well, I think we have to. We have to stand up for these issues. If we believe in the rules-based order, if we believe that the rights of smaller states such as ourselves should be respected, then we've got to do so, even when the party that is violating those rights happens to be, our great and powerful friend.
Next question, Jason Katsoukas.
Yeah.
Mr. Turnbull, thank you for your speech. Peter Dutton has said that should he become Prime Minister after the election, he will live at Kirribilli House.
Yep.
Should it matter where an Australian Prime Minister lives? And do you think he's sending the wrong message to the people of Queensland by choosing to live at Kirribilli House?
Well, look, he's been in Parliament longer than I was, and he's run in more elections than I did, but if I was running in a seat in Brisbane, I wouldn't be saying the minute I become Prime Minister I'm leaving to live in Sydney. I wouldn't. I mean, I don't think that's a wise thing to say. Obviously, Lucy and I stayed living in Sydney. We stayed living in our own house, in our own electorate, right in the centre of our own electorate. We've been for 30 odd years. So, but I think, I think that'll be used against him. But I don't think it's going to. This is sort of one of the kind of gotcha issues in the election. I don't think it's a big deal, but I'm sure he's regretting having said that.
Thank you. Our next question is Miriam Webber from the Canberra Times, who's got a bit of interest in where Prime Ministers live.
Thanks, Mr. Turnbull. In 2018, you commissioned the authority review into the Federal Public Service, which recommended that a cap on the number of public servants be removed as a part of an essential first step to shoring up the capability of the APS for the decades to come. Under Labor, the cap was removed and the service is projected to grow by 41,000 places. The Coalition says they'll reverse that growth of 41,000 places, specifically in Canberra. Do you support that plan?
Well, look, I won't either support it or oppose it, but I just make this point. It was becoming very obvious to me when I was Prime Minister, and this is why we set up this inquiry, and this was something that Martin Parkinson and I talked about a lot, and we set this up, as becoming obvious to me that there were far too many consultants being used. Now, I've got nothing against consultants. I'm sure many of them are here. Love yous all, say so. But you run the risk that you de-skill the APS. Okay, so you've got to. Look, I'll give you an example. This is the attitude, and this is what I mean. My colleagues, particularly Matthias, had a different view. So it wasn't. It was I am sceptical about the cult of consultants. I'll give you an example. When I was Communications Minister, I wanted to have a line-by-line cost review of the ABC and SBS, the public broadcasters. And Lucy and I had actually done that for the 10 network, in the early 90s. So I knew what, when we restructured the 10 network, I knew what needed to be done. So I said to the department, you should do this. And they said, we'll have to, get some big consulting firm in. I said, hang on. You're the Department of Communications. Supervising the public broadcasters is your core business. You do it. And I insisted that they do it. We've hired a very smart man who just retired as the CFO of the 7 network and got him as a domain expert for a modest fee, but it was the only consultant we had, and they did that work. But it was really interesting to me, coming back into government in 2013 after having been out since 2007, how the reflexive action was get a consultant. I mean, I think we need to ensure that the APS is efficient, that competent people are retained and incompetent ones are eased out. Obviously, all of those things, but you cannot afford to de-skill the public service. So that was actually the reason, one of the main reasons why that inquiry, which David Thodey chaired, was set up. Sadly, I wasn't around when it reported.
Do you think Labor's heading in the right direction from what you can see in terms of hiring more public servants and reducing our...
Well, as long as they're capable, yeah. I mean, but it's not a question. It's a bit like defence spending. Is it better to spend 4% or 3% or 5% of GDP on defence? Well, it depends what you're spending it on. And is it better to have 50,000 public servants hired or 40,000? Well, it depends what they do and how capable they are. So it's always a good day to hire capable people. That's the question. And my concern is that you run the risk of de-skilling your APS. And of course, you say to a young person who wants to do this kind of work, if you want to do really interesting work, go and get a job with a consultant, don't work in the APS. And I think that's a problem.
Thank you.
Thank you. A couple of questions to go. Nick Stewart.
Thanks, Mr Turnbull. You make the point that we have a secret ballot here, and so I'm not going to ask you about your vote, but in a number of electorates now, such as Wentworth, we have both Liberal and Labor and dynamic independents who are coming up with their own well-researched public policy ideas, putting them forward. Do you think that the old two-party model is dead? Do you think that is going to be a good thing? And do you think that there are very good reasons to vote for an independent?
Well, let me leave off the last one, but I think the arrival of the Teals is a very, very healthy development. And wouldn't have happened if we didn't have compulsory voting and preferential voting, which we've had for 100 years. So Australians, all of us should be very proud of that. Basically, you look at the US, it's frozen in that two-party system. Electorates are gerrymandered, and so your congressmen and women are far more extreme, because to win a Republic, the seat, if you want to win a seat that belongs to the Republicans, you've got to get the Republican zealots to vote for you in the primary, and same on the other side. So I think what the Teal movement was able to do was to basically say, in this case to the Liberal Party, but I think this will happen, with independents to Labor too, to say to the major party, and Lee did this, with Labor, by the way, to say, you have gone too far in one direction, you're not doing enough on climate change or whatever, and so some Liberal voters will vote for the independent. There are a lot of people who voted for me who are supporting a leg respender. I mean, I can't tell you how many campaign workers of mine I see wandering around with a leg respender caps on. So, but I think it's a healthy thing, because you want to have a competitive, dynamic electoral system. It's uncomfortable for the big parties, but keeping the big parties comfortable should not be the objective of our democratic electoral system.
And our last question from Melissa Code.
Thanks for your speech, Melissa Code from the Mandarin. You talked about hope not being a strategy and invited us all to think more seriously about looking in a clear-eyed way at the facts and the risks that face us. If our sovereignty and values are important, what about interoperability when it comes to defence capability? Where do we start to draw the line about how integrated our defence systems are with the US?
Well, again, there are many people here who have forgotten more about this than I'll ever know. There are many military people here. I can see quite a few admirals in particular here. But interoperability, integration is fine, I would say, just as an observer, as long as it does not impede your ability to act independently. If you are in a situation where you cannot actually operate your own weapon systems, capabilities, fly your planes, sail your submarines without the supervision of another country, then it isn't truly sovereign. And of course, this is one of the criticisms made of the nuclear-powered submarine plan. Again, that's another one that's been made, this issue about sovereignty. Sovereignty matters. One American general, friend of mine, said to me, I've many American four-stars who I know, so over the years, because it happens when you get to my age, said to me, you go on about sovereignty, Malcolm, but Australia's never really been sovereign. And I said, well, that's fine for you to say, but from our point of view, and this is the point, this is the thing, we've got to stop looking at our own country through the prism of Washington. We've got to start looking after ourselves. As I said, do you think if there was an Australian version of Donald Trump, do you think that that person would be tiptoeing around worrying about offending the United States? Of course not. He'd be standing up for Australia, and this is why I say I'm not saying I'm an admirer of Trump by any means, but and this is one of the reasons people voted for him, because they felt that he was on their side. Okay, and that's that's the challenge for our leaders, and they've got to be able to stand up. And if that means you get a brickbat or a Truth Social post, saying you're weak and ineffectual. You don't know anything about China. Then you should. If you're spooked by that, you shouldn't be in the job.
And I think on that note, thank you very much for a very informative and entertaining discussion.
Thank you.
Everyone, please accept our gift of membership for the club.
Oh, great.
Always welcome to come back, and we'll get you up to number 20.
Excellent. Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Thanks a lot.